What becomes truly interesting is what happens when we stop searching for proof of our value outside ourselves and begin exploring the possibility that the evidence has been present within us all along. I have found that many people spend years believing they must earn their worth through achievement, approval, status, or constant effort. Yet the deeper I look into the relationship between consciousness and biology, the more I see a different story emerging. Our bodies are not passive machines carrying us through life. They are dynamic systems responding every moment to the quality of our thoughts, the meaning we assign to our experiences, and the emotions we repeatedly practice. When we understand this connection, we begin to recognize that human potential is not merely a philosophical idea. It is woven into the architecture of our lives. I often invite people to consider a simple question. What if the most powerful force shaping our future is not found in external circumstances, but in the signals moving through our nervous system right now? Modern research continues to reveal that our bodies are constantly interpreting information from both the environment and the inner world. Every belief carries a biological signature. Every emotional state influences chemistry, hormones, immune activity, and patterns of neural communication. This does not mean positive thinking magically solves every challenge. It means our internal state participates in shaping how we experience, respond to, and recover from the events of life. For generations, ancient traditions observed that human beings possess a remarkable capacity to influence their inner condition. Today, many scientific discoveries are revealing mechanisms that help explain why. When we experience gratitude, compassion, appreciation, or genuine connection, measurable changes occur throughout the body. Heart rhythms become more coherent. Stress responses begin to soften. Cognitive flexibility improves. The body shifts resources away from survival mode and toward restoration, growth, and adaptation. These changes are not imaginary. They are biological expressions of an inner experience. What fascinates me most is that many people have been taught to view themselves as incomplete. They assume wisdom, power, creativity, and resilience originate somewhere beyond them, yet biology suggests something extraordinary. Every cell carries instructions for growth, repair, communication, and adaptation. The intelligence required to coordinate trillions of processes is already operating within us every second. We do not consciously direct most of these functions, yet they continue with astonishing precision. Rather than seeing ourselves as disconnected fragments struggling through existence, we can begin to see ourselves as participants in an intelligent living system. This perspective changes how we relate to challenge. When fear dominates our perception, the body prepares for danger, attention narrows, possibilities seem limited, creative solutions become harder to recognize. But when we cultivate emotional balance, even in difficult circumstances, different pathways emerge. The brain gains access to broader networks of information. Intuition becomes easier to notice. Relationships improve. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. In this sense, consciousness is not separate from biology. Consciousness is constantly informing biology. I have noticed that one of the greatest misunderstandings about human transformation is the belief that change begins with behavior alone. Behavior matters, but behavior is often the visible surface of a much deeper process. Beneath every action exists a perception. Beneath every perception exists a belief. Beneath every belief exists an emotional pattern reinforcing the story we tell ourselves. If we attempt to change actions without addressing the underlying emotional environment, the results often remain temporary. Lasting transformation occurs when the internal story changes and the body begins receiving different signals. This is where self-awareness becomes profoundly practical. Observing our thoughts is not an abstract exercise. It allows us to identify the patterns directing our physiology. If I repeatedly tell myself that I am powerless, my body responds to that message. If I continually rehearse anxiety about the future, my nervous system prepares for threats that may never arrive. Over time, these patterns become familiar, and familiarity can easily be mistaken for truth. Yet awareness creates a space between the pattern and the person experiencing it. Within that space, new possibilities emerge. The remarkable thing is that the body appears designed for this process. Neural pathways can reorganize. Emotional habits can change. Stress responses can be recalibrated. Human beings are not fixed structures. We are adaptive systems capable of learning throughout life. This adaptability suggests that our potential is far greater than many of us were led to believe. The blueprint for growth is not something we must import from the outside. It is already embedded within the systems that sustain us. When I reflect on the convergence of ancient insight and contemporary science, I see a common theme appearing again and again. Human beings thrive when thoughts, emotions, and actions become aligned. Conflict between what we believe, what we feel, and how we live creates internal friction. Alignment creates coherence, and coherence may be one of the most overlooked resources available to us, because when the mind and body begin speaking the same language, we start to discover capacities that have been waiting quietly beneath the surface, capacities that become visible the moment we realize that our deepest abilities are not reserved for a select few. They emerge whenever we create the conditions that allow them to surface. I have seen people transform their health, relationships, creativity, and sense of purpose after changing the emotional patterns they carried for years. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because their internal environment changed. They stopped identifying with limitation and started observing it. They stopped feeding old narratives and began cultivating new experiences. Gradually, biology followed consciousness. Energy increased. Clarity expanded. Opportunities that once seemed invisible became easier to recognize. This does not happen overnight, and it does not require perfection. It requires consistency, curiosity, and a willingness to participate in our own evolution. The more closely we examine the signals we send through thought, feeling, expectation, and attention, the more we begin to uncover patterns hidden beneath ordinary daily experience itself. Because it is within those hidden patterns that many of the answers we seek begin to reveal themselves. I have often noticed that people underestimate the influence of repeated emotional experiences. We tend to focus on dramatic events, major decisions, or significant turning points, yet much of our lives is shaped by the emotions we practice every day without realizing it. The body learns through repetition. Just as a musician develops skill through consistent practice, our nervous system becomes conditioned by the emotional states we return to most often. Over time, those states can become our baseline reality. This is why awareness matters so deeply. If the body becomes familiar with frustration, disappointment, self-doubt, or chronic stress, those experiences can begin to feel normal even when they are limiting us. Many individuals spend years carrying emotional patterns that originated in earlier stages of life. The original circumstances may have disappeared long ago, but the biological response remains active. The body remembers what the conscious mind may have forgotten. Understanding this changes how we approach personal growth. Instead of asking what is wrong with us, we can begin asking what patterns have been reinforced so consistently that they now operate automatically. When viewed through this lens, healing becomes less about fixing something broken and more about restoring communication between different aspects of ourselves. The mind generates meaning, the body responds to that meaning. Emotions become the language connecting the two. Every feeling carries information. Every sensation tells a story about how the body is interpreting our experience in the present moment. The challenge is that many of us have learned to ignore these signals. We become distracted by noise, overwhelmed by responsibilities, or disconnected from the subtle messages arising within. Yet some of the most profound insights emerge when we become still enough to listen. I am not referring to escaping life or withdrawing from responsibility. I am talking about creating moments where awareness can expand beyond the constant stream of external demands. In those moments, we often discover that beneath stress, fear, and uncertainty exists a deeper level of intelligence. It is not loud, it does not compete for attention, but it is consistently available. Many people describe it as intuition. Others describe it as inner knowing. Whatever language we choose, the experience points toward a capacity that seems to emerge when mental noise begins to quiet. Modern neuroscience offers fascinating perspectives on this phenomenon. The brain is constantly processing far more information than conscious awareness can handle. Most of this information remains below the threshold of conscious attention. Yet the body continues gathering data, recognizing patterns, and responding to subtle changes in the environment. Sometimes what we call intuition may reflect the integration of information occurring beyond ordinary conscious awareness. Rather than being mysterious in a supernatural sense, it may represent a sophisticated biological capacity that becomes more accessible when we develop greater self-awareness. This possibility carries important implications for how we live. If our bodies possess extraordinary mechanisms for perception, adaptation, and intelligence, then the quality of our inner environment becomes increasingly significant. What happens when we spend years consumed by fear-based expectations? What happens when we continually imagine negative outcomes before they occur? The body responds as though those imagined scenarios deserve preparation. Stress chemistry becomes activated. Energy is redirected towards survival. Over time, this can influence health, behavior, relationships, and overall well-being. Now consider the opposite possibility. What happens when we intentionally cultivate emotional states associated with appreciation, confidence, curiosity, and connection? The body receives different instructions. New neural pathways strengthen. Different hormones become more active. Perception changes. Possibilities that once seemed distant begin to appear more attainable. Again, this is not about denying challenges or pretending difficulties do not exist. It is about recognizing that our response to experience becomes part of the experience itself. One of the most empowering realizations I have encountered is that human beings possess the ability to influence this process consciously. We may not control every event that enters our lives, but we can participate in shaping how those events are interpreted within us. This participation represents a profound form of agency. It shifts our focus away from helplessness and toward responsibility. Not responsibility in the sense of blame, but responsibility in the sense of recognizing our capacity to respond with awareness. Ancient cultures understood that the quality of attention shapes the quality of experience. Today's scientific research increasingly supports this idea. Attention influences neural activity. Neural activity influences chemistry. Chemistry influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. What begins as an internal focus eventually expresses itself in the external world. The process may appear subtle at first, but over months and years, the effects can become substantial. I believe this is why practices involving reflection, gratitude, focused awareness, and emotional regulation continue to appear across cultures and throughout history. They are not merely philosophical exercises. They are methods for influencing the relationship between consciousness and biology. They help create coherence between what we think, what we feel, and how we act. And when coherence increases, many people report experiencing greater clarity, resilience, creativity, and purpose. There is another dimension to this conversation that deserves attention. Human beings are inherently relational. Our emotional states do not exist in isolation. We influence one another constantly through communication, behavior, presence, and energy. A calm individual can affect an entire room. A fearful environment can alter the physiology of everyone within it. This suggests that personal transformation extends beyond individual benefit. The way we regulate our own internal state contributes to the environments we help create for others. When we begin understanding ourselves as participants in interconnected systems, a new perspective emerges. Every thought, emotion, and action becomes part of a larger field of influence. The choices we make internally ripple outward through families, communities, workplaces, and relationships. The state of our consciousness is not merely a private experience, it becomes part of the collective environments we inhabit together. And perhaps this is where the conversation becomes even more compelling, because if our biology is continuously responding to our beliefs, emotions, expectations, and perceptions, then the next question naturally arises. What happens when large groups of people begin shifting those patterns simultaneously? What becomes possible when coherence is not limited to individuals but begins appearing across communities, organizations, and entire populations? The implications extend far beyond personal growth and lead us into a deeper exploration of how human consciousness itself may interact with the world around us in ways that most people have never been encouraged to consider. Because once we begin exploring consciousness beyond the level of the individual, we encounter questions that challenge many of our assumptions about human potential. I have often reflected on why certain groups of people seem capable of extraordinary cooperation during times of crisis, while at other times communities become divided by fear, confusion, and mistrust. The external circumstances may differ, but beneath the surface there is often a common factor, the emotional field shared by the people involved. When fear becomes contagious, perception narrows collectively. When trust and clarity spread, new possibilities emerge that were previously invisible. This observation becomes especially important when we consider the biological nature of human connection. We are not isolated organisms operating independently of one another. Every day our bodies are reading subtle signals from the people around us. Facial expressions, vocal tones, body language, and emotional states are constantly influencing our nervous systems. Long before conscious analysis begins, the body is already gathering information and adjusting its responses. In many ways, human beings are designed for connection. Our biology reflects this reality at every level. Consider what happens when we enter an environment filled with tension. Even before anyone speaks, we often sense that something is different. Muscles tighten, breathing changes, attention becomes more vigilant. Now imagine entering a space where people feel safe, supported, and genuinely connected. The body responds differently. Stress begins to decrease. Openness increases. Creativity becomes more accessible. These reactions occur so naturally that we rarely stop to examine them, yet they reveal something profound about the relationship between consciousness and biology. The quality of our internal state affects not only our own lives, but also the experiences of those around us. This means personal growth is never solely personal. Every effort we make to cultivate emotional balance contributes to the environments we share with others. Every moment of patience influences relationships. Every act of compassion alters the emotional atmosphere of a family, workplace, or community. The effects may seem small individually, but collectively they become significant. I believe this is one reason ancient wisdom traditions often emphasize inner transformation before external change. If we attempt to create lasting change in the world without addressing the consciousness from which our actions arise, we may simply reproduce the same patterns in new forms. History provides countless examples of this dynamic. People pursue progress while carrying unresolved fear, anger, or division, and eventually those internal patterns shape the outcomes they create. Genuine transformation begins within because the external world often reflects the quality of consciousness expressed through human behavior. Modern science is beginning to reveal fascinating evidence supporting this perspective. Studies involving emotional regulation, social connection, and collective behavior consistently demonstrate that human beings influence one another in measurable ways. Our emotional states can spread through groups. Stress can become contagious. So can optimism, resilience, and cooperation. The boundaries between individual and collective experience may be far more interconnected than we once believed. This realization invites a deeper level of responsibility. If my emotional state influences others, then cultivating inner coherence becomes more than a personal wellness practice. It becomes a contribution. The calm I develop within myself affects how I communicate. The clarity I cultivate affects how I make decisions. The compassion I embody affects how others experience their interactions with me. In this sense, consciousness becomes an active force shaping the environments we inhabit. Yet there is another layer to this exploration that I find especially compelling. Human beings possess a remarkable capacity to imagine future possibilities. We are not limited to reacting to present circumstances. We can envision outcomes that do not yet exist. We can mentally rehearse new realities. We can generate emotional experiences associated with possibilities before they become physical events. This ability may be one of the most powerful capacities we possess. Many people underestimate the biological significance of imagination. They assume imagination belongs only to fantasy or entertainment. But neuroscience reveals that the brain often responds to vividly imagined experiences in ways remarkably similar to actual experiences. Mental rehearsal can influence neural pathways. Visualization can affect performance. Expectations can shape perception. The images we repeatedly hold in awareness may become instructions, influencing the body's responses. This raises an intriguing question. If the body responds to thoughts and emotions as meaningful signals, what kind of future are we rehearsing each day? Are we repeatedly practicing limitation, fear, and doubt? Or are we cultivating states aligned with growth, possibility, and resilience? The answer matters because repeated mental and emotional patterns gradually influence our biological baseline. I have observed that many individuals unknowingly become experts at anticipating problems. They mentally rehearse worst-case scenarios with extraordinary consistency. They imagine failure before taking action. They expect disappointment before opportunities have a chance to unfold. The body adapts to these expectations. Energy becomes organized around protection rather than expansion. Creativity becomes secondary to survival. But something remarkable happens when awareness interrupts this cycle. The moment we recognize a pattern, we gain the ability to change our relationship with it. We no longer have to accept every thought as truth. We can observe it, question it, and choose whether it deserves our attention. This shift may appear simple, yet it represents a profound transformation in consciousness. We move from being unconsciously driven by patterns to consciously engaging with them. Over time, this process creates new possibilities. We become less reactive and more intentional. Emotional triggers lose some of their power. Fear no longer dominates every decision. The nervous system learns that safety and growth can coexist. Gradually, a different version of ourselves begins to emerge, not because we have become someone new, but because we have removed layers of conditioning that once limited our expression. As this unfolds, many people discover a surprising truth. The qualities they spent years searching for outside themselves were present all along. Strength was there, creativity was there, resilience was there, clarity was there. These capacities did not need to be imported from external sources. They needed conditions that allowed them to emerge. Much like a seed contains the blueprint for a tree, human beings appear to carry latent potentials waiting for the right environment to activate them. And this brings us to a possibility that deserves careful consideration. If our biology already contains extraordinary capacities for adaptation, healing, learning, connection, and transformation, then perhaps the greatest challenge is not acquiring something new. Perhaps the challenge is remembering what has always been present beneath the noise of conditioning, beneath the stories of limitation, and beneath the assumptions that have shaped our perception for so long. Because when we begin examining those assumptions closely, we uncover an entirely new question about the nature of human identity itself, a question that changes how we understand consciousness, potential, and the untapped capabilities quietly waiting within every one of us. Because the moment we begin questioning our assumptions about identity, we step into territory that has fascinated philosophers, scientists, and seekers of knowledge for centuries. I have often wondered why so many people define themselves primarily through circumstances, roles, achievements, failures, or past experiences. While these aspects certainly influence our lives, they do not fully explain the depth of who we are. There appears to be something more fundamental operating beneath the changing events of life, something that remains present, regardless of success or struggle, certainty or confusion, gain or loss. When I observe the patterns of human behavior, I notice that many forms of suffering emerge from identification with temporary conditions. A person experiences failure and begins believing they are a failure. Someone encounters rejection and starts defining themselves through that experience. Another faces uncertainty and assumes uncertainty reflects their true nature. Over time, these interpretations become deeply ingrained. The body adapts to them, the nervous system learns them. Eventually, what began as an experience becomes an identity. Yet experiences are constantly changing. Circumstances evolve. Relationships transform. Knowledge expands. The person we were 10 years ago is not the person we are today. Even the cells within our bodies are continually renewing themselves. Change is woven into the fabric of life. If everything is changing, then perhaps our deepest identity cannot be limited to any single experience, achievement, or condition. This realization opens an extraordinary possibility. What if awareness itself is one of the most important dimensions of human existence? Thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and fall. Situations appear and disappear. Yet awareness remains capable of observing all of them. The observer is not identical to the thoughts being observed. The observer is not identical to the emotions passing through the body. This distinction may seem subtle, but it has profound implications for how we understand ourselves. I have found that many people experience a dramatic shift when they begin recognizing this difference. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," they begin noticing, "I am experiencing anxiety." Instead of believing, "I am broken," they recognize, "I am observing a feeling of limitation." This change in perspective creates psychological and biological space. The nervous system becomes less trapped within reactive patterns. Awareness expands beyond them. Interestingly, modern neuroscience provides insights that support aspects of this process. Research increasingly suggests that the brain is highly adaptable and continually shaped by experience. The stories we tell ourselves influence neural pathways. Repeated perceptions strengthen specific networks. Attention reinforces patterns, yet if patterns can be learned, they can also be modified. This means identity may be far more flexible than many people assume. The implications are enormous. If identity is not fixed, then growth is not merely possible, it is natural. The human system appears designed for continuous adaptation. Every challenge contains information. Every experience provides opportunities for learning. Even difficult periods can become catalysts for transformation when approached with awareness. What matters is not only what happens to us, but how we interpret and integrate those experiences. I believe this is why some individuals emerge from adversity with greater wisdom while others become trapped by the same circumstances. The difference is often not the event itself. It is the meaning assigned to the event. Meaning influences emotion. Emotion influences biology. Biology influences behavior. Over time, those interactions shape the trajectory of a life. The stories we choose to reinforce become powerful forces directing our future. This does not mean we should deny pain or pretend challenges are easy. Genuine growth requires honesty. Difficult emotions deserve acknowledgement. Loss deserves compassion. Fear deserves understanding. But awareness allows us to experience these realities without becoming permanently defined by them. We can honor an experience without turning it into an identity. One of the most empowering discoveries in this process is recognizing that attention functions like a form of energy investment. Wherever attention consistently flows, biological resources tend to follow. When attention becomes trapped in resentment, the body reflects that pattern. When attention becomes focused on possibility, learning, and growth, different patterns emerge. This does not happen because reality magically changes. It happens because perception changes, and perception influences how we engage with reality. Think about how often opportunities go unnoticed simply because they fall outside our expectations. The brain naturally filters information according to what it considers important. If we expect limitation, we become highly skilled at finding evidence that confirms limitation. If we expect possibility, we begin noticing options that were previously ignored. In many cases, the external world has not changed dramatically. What has changed is the lens through which it is perceived. This understanding invites us to become more intentional about the stories we carry. Every belief functions like a lens. Some beliefs expand perception, others restrict it. Some create resilience, others reinforce helplessness. The challenge is that many beliefs operate below conscious awareness. We inherit them from families, cultures, educational systems, and personal experiences. Over time, they become so familiar that we rarely question them. Yet, questioning them may be one of the most important acts of personal evolution. The moment we ask whether a belief is truly serving us, we create the possibility for transformation. The moment we examine an assumption rather than automatically accepting it, awareness grows. New perspectives become available. New behaviors become possible. I have seen people completely alter the direction of their lives through this process, not because they changed everything overnight, but because they changed the assumptions guiding their choices. They stopped viewing themselves through the lens of past limitations. They began engaging with life from a different level of awareness. Gradually, their biology reflected those changes. Confidence increased, stress decreased, creativity expanded, relationships improved. What seemed impossible began appearing achievable. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all this is that human potential does not appear to have a fixed endpoint. Every time we believe we have reached the limits of what is possible, new discoveries emerge. New capacities reveal themselves. New understandings reshape old assumptions. The frontier of human development continues expanding, suggesting that much remains unexplored. And as we continue this exploration, another question naturally arises. If awareness can influence biology, if beliefs can shape perception, and if identity itself is more flexible than we once imagined, then what other capacities may be waiting beneath the surface of ordinary experience? What aspects of human potential remain dormant simply because we have not yet learned how to access them? Because the evidence increasingly suggests that the untapped possibilities within us extend far beyond what conventional thinking has encouraged us to consider, leading us toward an even deeper investigation of the hidden relationship between consciousness, biology, and the future evolution of human experience itself. And when I explore this possibility more deeply, I find myself returning again and again to the idea that human evolution may not be driven solely by external advancement, but by internal recognition. Not recognition in an intellectual sense alone, but a direct experiential awareness of capacities that have always been present, yet not fully utilized. It is as if consciousness itself is learning to perceive its own depth through the instrument of the human nervous system. I often reflect on how limited perception can feel when we are fully immersed in routine thinking. The mind tends to operate within familiar boundaries, recycling known ideas, familiar emotional reactions, and predictable interpretations. Yet every so often, something interrupts that cycle. A moment of clarity arises without effort. A sense of expanded awareness appears as though the usual boundaries of identity temporarily loosen. In those moments, perception feels less constrained, and life appears more interconnected, more dynamic, and more responsive than we typically assume. What intrigues me is that these moments are not rare anomalies reserved for a select few. They seem to be natural states of the human system, accessible when internal conditions shift. This suggests that expanded awareness may not be something we must acquire, but something we learn to allow. And what prevents that allowance is often not lack of ability, but the presence of mental and emotional noise that obscures subtler levels of perception. I have noticed that when individuals begin practicing sustained attention, even in simple forms such as observing their breath, witnessing their thoughts without judgment, or becoming aware of bodily sensations, something begins to reorganize internally. At first, the mind resists stillness. It prefers movement, distraction, and familiar loops of thinking. But with patience, a different quality of awareness begins to emerge. Thoughts continue, but they no longer dominate the entire field of perception. Emotions arise, but they no longer define the totality of experience. This shift creates a kind of internal spaciousness. Within that space, new insights become possible. People often describe noticing patterns they were previously blind to. They begin recognizing emotional triggers earlier, before they escalate. They become aware of subtle choices that were previously automatic. Over time, this awareness transforms how they respond to life. Instead of reacting instantly, they begin responding consciously. From a biological perspective, this makes sense. The nervous system is highly sensitive to repeated patterns. When we interrupt automatic cycles of reaction, we create opportunities for new neural pathways to form. These pathways are not just abstract structures. They represent new ways of perceiving, feeling, and behaving. In this sense, awareness is not passive observation. It is an active shaping force within the architecture of the brain and body. I find it remarkable that something as intangible as attention can have such tangible effects on physical processes. Yet the more we explore this relationship, the clearer it becomes that consciousness and biology are not separate domains. They are deeply intertwined aspects of a single integrated system. One informs the other continuously. What we experience internally becomes part of the biological conversation taking place within us at every moment. This perspective also changes how we understand change itself. Many people expect transformation to be sudden, dramatic, or externally driven, but more often, meaningful change unfolds gradually through subtle shifts in perception. A new awareness emerges. A different interpretation replaces an old one. A familiar emotional response weakens. Over time, these small changes accumulate into significant transformation. I have observed that one of the greatest barriers to this process is impatience. The mind often wants immediate results, clear milestones, and visible confirmation that something is working. Yet internal transformation does not always follow visible timelines. It operates through layers of conditioning that may have been formed over many years. Rewiring those layers requires consistency rather than intensity. It requires presence rather than pressure. When individuals begin embracing this rhythm, something interesting happens. The urgency to force change begins to soften. Instead of trying to become someone different, they begin to understand themselves more deeply. This understanding naturally leads to change, not through struggle, but through clarity. As perception shifts, behavior follows more effortlessly. There is also a growing recognition that human beings are not isolated systems evolving independently. We exist within networks of influence, constantly exchanging information through language, emotion, and shared experience. This means that individual transformation has collective implications. When one person becomes more aware, more regulated, and more coherent internally, that state influences interactions with others. Over time, these interactions contribute to broader patterns of change. It is within this interconnected reality that the concept of human potential becomes even more expansive. Potential is not limited to individual achievement. It extends into how we affect the environments we participate in. It includes how our presence shapes communication, decision-making, creativity, and emotional tone within groups. In this sense, every individual becomes a point of influence within a larger system of consciousness expressed through human experience. As I consider this more deeply, I begin to see human evolution not as a distant destination, but as an ongoing process unfolding in real time. It is expressed in every moment of increased awareness, every shift in perception, every instance where reaction gives way to response. It is present whenever we pause long enough to notice what is actually happening within us rather than being carried entirely by habitual patterns. And yet, even as we explore these possibilities, there remains an open question that continues to invite deeper inquiry. If consciousness is capable of influencing biology, perception, and behavior in such profound ways, then what lies beyond our current understanding of this relationship? What aspects of awareness remain unmeasured, unexplored, or not yet fully integrated into our models of human experience? Because the more closely I examine the intersection of mind and body, the more it appears that we are only beginning to glimpse the depth of what it means to be consciously alive, and this realization opens a pathway into questions that lead even further into the unknown dimensions of human potential, where the next stage of understanding quietly begins to emerge. And when I sit with that unknown long enough, I begin to notice something subtle but consistent beneath the surface of all inquiry, a quiet intelligence that does not announce itself as knowledge, but reveals itself as pattern recognition unfolding in real time. It is not something I can hold as a fixed conclusion, because the moment I try to define it, it seems to move beyond the definition. Instead, it feels more like a living process of awareness continuously reorganizing itself through experience, observation, and reflection. I have often found that the human mind struggles with uncertainty, not because uncertainty is inherently threatening, but because the mind prefers closure. It wants to resolve questions quickly, categorize experiences neatly, and stabilize reality into predictable frameworks. Yet the deeper I explore consciousness, the more I see that uncertainty may not be a problem to eliminate, but a condition that allows perception to expand. In the absence of absolute certainty, awareness becomes more flexible, more attentive, more alive to subtle signals that would otherwise be overlooked. There are moments when I notice how quickly the mind fills gaps with assumptions. If information is incomplete, interpretation rushes in to complete the picture. This process happens so rapidly that it often goes unnoticed. Yet when I slow down my attention, I begin to see how many of my conclusions are constructed rather than directly perceived. This realization does not weaken understanding. Instead, it softens rigidity and allows new interpretations to emerge without immediate resistance. What becomes increasingly clear is that perception is not a passive reception of reality. It is an active participation in shaping how reality is organized within consciousness. The brain is constantly selecting, filtering, and emphasizing information based on prior experience, emotional significance, and learned expectations. This means that two individuals can be exposed to the same situation and yet experience entirely different realities internally. Not because reality itself has changed, but because the interpretive systems are different. When I reflect on this, I begin to understand why transformation often begins with questioning perception itself. If perception is the lens through which all experience is filtered, then any change in that lens alters the entire experience of life. This is not about denying external reality, but about recognizing the role internal structure plays in shaping how that reality is encountered moment by moment. I have also observed that emotional states act as powerful organizers of perception. When a person is in a state of fear, the mind prioritizes threat detection. When a person is in a state of openness, the mind begins to recognize possibility. These shifts happen automatically, influencing not only thought patterns, but also bodily responses. Heart rate, breathing rhythm, muscle tension, and even hormonal activity adjust in response to emotional tone. This suggests that emotion is not simply a reaction to life, but a regulatory system that shapes how life is experienced biologically. From this perspective, emotional awareness becomes a form of biological literacy. The more accurately we can recognize what we are feeling, the more effectively we can understand what the body is communicating. Instead of being overwhelmed by emotional states, we begin to interpret them as information. Each feeling becomes a signal pointing toward an underlying perception or belief that is active in the moment. As this awareness deepens, something interesting begins to occur. Emotional reactions that once felt automatic begin to slow down. There is a gap between stimulus and response that was not previously noticeable. In that gap, choice becomes possible. This is where conscious change begins to take root, not by suppressing emotion, but by becoming aware of the mechanisms through which emotion influences behavior. I find it remarkable that such subtle shifts in awareness can produce tangible changes in lived experience. Decisions feel different when they arise from awareness rather than reactivity. Communication changes when it is no longer driven solely by emotional impulse. Relationships shift when responses are informed by presence rather than automatic patterning. These changes may appear small individually, but over time they reshape the trajectory of experience in profound ways. Another layer of this exploration involves recognizing how deeply human identity is shaped by repetition. The thoughts we think most often, the emotional states we return to regularly, and the behaviors we repeat become the foundation of what we call personality. Yet personality is not fixed. It is a dynamic expression of repeated patterns. When those patterns change, personality evolves accordingly. This understanding reframes the idea of personal growth. Growth is not the addition of something external. It is the gradual reorganization of internal patterns that have become habitual. It is the recognition that what we identify as me is not a static entity, but a continuously evolving system of thoughts, emotions, memories, and perceptions interacting in real time. I have seen that when individuals begin to observe themselves without judgment, they create space for these patterns to shift naturally. Judgment tends to solidify identity. Observation allows fluidity. In observation, there is no need to immediately fix or change what is noticed. There is only awareness. And within awareness, transformation begins to occur without force. There is a kind of intelligence in the body that responds to sustained awareness. When attention is consistently brought to internal processes with curiosity rather than resistance, the system begins to reorganize itself. Old emotional charges lose intensity. Habitual reactions lose momentum. New responses emerge that were previously inaccessible. This suggests that awareness itself may be one of the primary catalysts of change within human biology. As I continue exploring these ideas, I become increasingly aware that human potential may not be something we approach linearly, as though moving step by step toward a final state of completion. Instead, it may be more accurate to view it as an unfolding process of recognition, where deeper layers of capability become accessible as consciousness becomes more refined in its ability to observe itself. In this unfolding, there are moments when old frameworks of understanding no longer feel sufficient. Concepts that once seemed stable begin to feel too limited to contain the complexity of lived experience. During these moments, the mind may attempt to rebuild certainty, but something deeper encourages openness instead. It is as though awareness is inviting itself to expand beyond previous boundaries, not through effort, but through attention itself. And in that expanding field of attention, I find myself standing at the edge of a question that does not seek immediate resolution, but instead opens into further exploration, a question that continues to unfold the more closely I listen to it. Because what appears to be emerging now is not a conclusion, but a threshold into something even more fundamental about the nature of consciousness, where understanding begins to dissolve into direct experience, and experience begins to reveal layers that have not yet been fully, and where understanding begins to dissolve into direct experience, and experience begins to reveal layers that have not yet been fully accessible. In ordinary awareness, I find myself noticing that attention itself becomes the primary instrument through which reality is interpreted, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived physiological process occurring moment by moment within the nervous system, shaping perception, emotion, and response in ways that are often invisible until they are directly observed. I have come to recognize that the quality of attention we bring to our inner world determines the clarity with which we perceive outer reality. When attention is fragmented, scattered, or constantly pulled outward, the internal landscape becomes noisy and interpretation becomes reactive. But when attention becomes steady, coherent, and gently sustained, something different begins to emerge, a sense of continuity within experience where thoughts, emotions, and sensations are observed without immediate judgment. In this state, I often notice that perception expands beyond habitual boundaries, allowing subtler information to be recognized that would otherwise remain filtered out by automatic processing. This includes subtle emotional shifts, micro-sensations within the body, and faint intuitive signals that seem to arise from deeper integrative processing rather than linear thought over time. These observations begin to reveal that what we call intuition may be less mysterious than previously assumed and more related to the brain and body integrating vast amounts of information below conscious awareness. This does not reduce its significance, but instead highlights the extraordinary capacity of human biology to process complexity in ways that exceed deliberate reasoning. I find that when individuals begin trusting these subtle signals while remaining grounded in awareness, their decision-making becomes more integrated, less fragmented, and more responsive to the full context of experience. This integration between intuition and analytical thinking appears to create a more balanced cognitive state where insight and reasoning support rather than oppose each other. As this balance develops, I observe that stress responses begin to soften, not because challenges disappear, but because the internal relationship to challenge changes. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel navigable, and what once felt threatening begins to feel informative. This shift in perception has profound implications for how we understand resilience, because resilience is not only the ability to endure difficulty, but the ability to remain aware within it. And as awareness deepens within difficulty, something remarkable begins to unfold, a gradual reorganization of internal patterns that once defined the limits of experience. I begin to see that this reorganization is not forced, but emergent, arising naturally, when attention is no longer bound exclusively to reactive loops. Instead, attention becomes more spacious, allowing previously unconscious material to surface, be observed, and gradually integrated. This process often feels subtle rather than dramatic, yet its effects accumulate over time, shaping identity, perception, and emotional stability. I have also noticed that as this integration continues, individuals begin to experience a reduction in internal conflict. As previously competing parts of the psyche begin to align, this alignment does not erase complexity, but harmonizes it, creating a sense of internal coherence that supports clearer perception and more grounded action. From here, I begin to sense that the evolution of consciousness may be less about acquiring new abilities and more about removing the distortions that obscure what is already present. And as this recognition deepens, I find myself standing at the edge of yet another unfolding inquiry that seems to point toward dimensions of experience that are still forming at the edge of awareness, because what I am beginning to notice is that awareness itself may not be static at all, but continuously evolving through the very act of observing experience. And in that realization, a deeper question begins to emerge, not as a conclusion, but as an opening into further exploration, where the next layer of understanding seems to be quietly waiting just beyond the threshold of what can currently be described in words. And so I continue to observe, to listen, and to remain present with the unfolding mystery. I notice that in this sustained presence, even ordinary moments begin to reveal subtle depth that was previously overlooked. Sound becomes richer, sensation becomes more detailed, and thought itself appears less like a fixed structure and more like a flowing process. This shift in perception creates a sense of continuity between inner and outer experience, where boundaries feel less rigid and more permeable. I find myself increasingly aware that what we call reality is not merely something observed, but something continuously co-created through attention, interpretation, and embodied response. And as this recognition deepens, it leads me further into the question of what remains when all assumptions about separation, identity, and limitation are gently set aside, because it is in that space of openness that something unfamiliar begins to make itself known, not as an idea, but as an immediate experience that continues to unfold beyond the limits of conceptual understanding and invites a deeper attention that remains open to what has not yet been fully revealed and still continues beyond what I can currently express. And even as language reaches its limits, I remain aware that experience itself is still unfolding in ways that continue to exceed description. There is a sense that something deeper is always present beneath the surface of thought, quietly organizing perception, memory, and meaning. And as I continue to rest in that awareness, I begin to sense the emergence of a question that does not seek an answer, but instead opens into a deeper silence, where perception itself seems to expand once again beyond what I thought was possible and beyond what I can currently articulate. And in that unfolding space, I find myself noticing that even the sense of self that I once considered stable now feels more like a movement within awareness itself, continuously shifting, revealing, and dissolving into something that I am still in the process of beginning to understand as awareness continues quietly unfolding beyond. Awareness continues quietly unfolding beyond what the mind can stabilize into definition, and in that unfolding, I begin to notice that even the effort to understand becomes part of the same movement being observed, as if the act of seeking and the thing being sought are not separate processes, but expressions of a single continuous field of awareness exploring itself through different levels of clarity and distortion. I find this realization both humbling and disorienting because it challenges the habitual assumption that there is a fixed point of reference called me, from which everything is being interpreted. Instead, what appears is a fluid dynamic process where perception, thought, emotion, memory, and sensation are constantly reorganizing in response to both internal and external conditions. And yet within this movement, there is a quiet continuity that does not seem to change even when everything else does. I often describe this continuity as the simple fact of knowing, or the background presence that remains aware regardless of what content is passing through experience. And when attention rests here, even briefly, something softens in the nervous system, as if the body recognizes a deeper safety that is not dependent on external circumstances. This recognition does not erase challenges or dissolve complexity, but it changes the way complexity is held within awareness, allowing experience to unfold without immediate contraction or resistance. And as this becomes more familiar, I begin to observe subtle shifts in how thought organizes itself. Thoughts appear less like commands that must be obeyed and more like transient events arising within a larger space of observation. This shift creates room for reflection before reaction, and in that space, new possibilities of response begin to emerge that were previously inaccessible when reactivity dominated perception. I notice that emotional intensity also begins to transform not by suppression, but by integration. Emotions still arise with full clarity, but they no longer overwhelm the entire field of awareness. Instead, they move through like waves across a much larger ocean of presence, and this metaphor becomes increasingly accurate in lived experience because the sense of being contained within emotion begins to dissolve and replaced by the recognition that emotion is contained within awareness itself. This reversal is subtle but profound, and it alters how identity is experienced, because identity is no longer anchored exclusively in emotional fluctuation, but in the capacity to remain aware of fluctuation itself. As this deepens, I find that memory begins to shift in its influence past. Experiences still exist within the mind, but they no longer define the present moment with the same rigidity. Instead, they appear as informational patterns that can be observed without reactivation of their original emotional charge. This creates a sense of psychological freedom that is not dependent on changing external conditions, but on changing the relationship to internal experience. And from this perspective, growth is no longer about becoming someone different in the future, but about becoming more fully aware of what is already occurring in the present moment without distortion or avoidance. I also begin to notice that attention itself has layers. There is a surface level of attention that is easily captured by external stimuli and internal narration, but beneath that, there is a deeper form of attention that is more stable, less reactive, and capable of holding multiple streams of experience simultaneously without fragmentation. This deeper attention seems to be what allows insight to emerge naturally rather than being forced, because insight is not something manufactured by effort, but something revealed when perception becomes sufficiently clear and unobstructed in this way. Clarity is not added to experience, it is uncovered within it as interference diminishes. And I find that the more I rest in this recognition, the more ordinary life begins to reveal extraordinary depth. Simple moments such as breathing, walking, or listening become portals into a more immediate experience of presence where time feels less linear and more spacious, as if each moment contains its own complete unfolding rather than being merely a transition towards something else. This altered sense of time also changes how goals and intentions are experienced, because the future is no longer something distant that must be constantly pursued, but something that is continuously shaped through present awareness and action. And in this recognition, I begin to see that the boundary between inner transformation and outer reality is far more porous than it initially appears, because changes in perception inevitably influence behavior, and changes in behavior inevitably influence experience. And over time, these subtle shifts accumulate into visible transformations in life circumstances, relationships, and patterns of engagement with the world. Yet even these changes are not the final point of inquiry, because beneath them remains the deeper question of what is the source from which perception itself arises. And as I rest with this question, without attempting to resolve it, I notice that awareness becomes even more open, less defined, and more receptive to what cannot yet be fully articulated. And in that openness, there is a sense that understanding is not something approaching completion, but something continuously unfolding without endpoint. And as this unfolding continues, I begin to recognize that even the sense of being an observer is not fixed, but gently dissolving into a wider field of experiencing that cannot be separated into observer and observed. And as this recognition deepens further, I find myself approaching a threshold where language itself begins to feel insufficient to contain the totality of what is being directly experienced, because what is becoming apparent now is not a concept to be held, but a living process that continues to reveal itself moment by moment in ways that consistently exceed prior expectations. And as I remain present with this unfolding, I sense that there is still more emerging beneath perception itself, something that is not yet fully formed in awareness, but is already influencing the way awareness organizes experience. And even as I try to remain descriptive, I notice that the description itself is being shaped by what it attempts to describe, creating a continuous loop of observation and expression that feeds back into itself. And in this loop, I begin to see that perhaps consciousness is not a static entity at all, but an ongoing process of self-revelation that never arrives at a final state, because its nature is movement awareness and unfolding simultaneously. And in this recognition, I continue to remain attentive to what is arising next without forcing direction, without seeking closure, and without assuming that what is currently known represents the limits of what is possible, because the field of experience continues to expand in ways that invite further inquiry, deeper presence, and a sustained openness to whatever may be revealed as awareness continues beyond what was previously thought to be the edge of perception itself. And as I continue within this unfolding field of awareness, I begin to notice a subtle refinement in the way experience organizes itself, almost as if perception is gradually becoming more transparent to itself, rather than filtered through layers of automatic interpretation. This transparency does not remove complexity from life, but allows complexity to be seen without distortion. And in that seeing, there is a quiet stabilization that does not depend on controlling external conditions. I find this particularly significant because it suggests that stability is not something imposed on experience, but something revealed when internal resistance decreases and attention becomes more receptive to what is already present in each moment. I often reflect on how much energy human beings spend trying to manage outcomes while overlooking the internal processes that shape how those outcomes are experienced. The mind tends to focus outward, seeking resolution through change in circumstance, yet the deeper transformation appears to occur inwardly in the way perception interprets circumstance itself. When this is understood even partially, there is a shift in orientation from control toward awareness, from effortful manipulation toward attentive observation, and from reactive engagement toward conscious participation in the unfolding of experience. What becomes increasingly clear in this state is that attention is not a neutral faculty. It is an active shaping force that determines which aspects of reality become amplified within awareness and which remain in the background. When attention is fragmented, experience feels equally fragmented, but when attention becomes unified, there is a corresponding sense of coherence in perception, thought, and emotion. This coherence does not eliminate challenge, but it changes the way challenge is integrated into the system, allowing for responses that are less driven by contraction and more informed by clarity. I begin to see that much of what we call personal limitation is not fixed, but context dependent, meaning that under certain conditions, capacities appear restricted, while under other conditions, those same capacities become accessible. This variability suggests that human potential is not a static quantity, but a dynamic expression of internal and external alignment. When internal states such as emotion, belief, and attention are in conflict, the system operates under strain, but when these elements begin to align, there is an increase in efficiency, clarity, and adaptability that can be felt not only psychologically, but physically within the body itself. There is also something important that emerges when I observe the relationship between memory and present awareness. Memory is often experienced as a record of past events, yet in lived experience, it functions more like an active filter, influencing how current reality is interpreted. When memory is emotionally charged, it can reshape perception in real time, causing the present moment to be experienced through the lens of past impressions rather than direct observation. However, when awareness becomes strong enough to hold memory without identification, the influence of memory shifts. It becomes information rather than identity. And this subtle change alters the entire quality of experience. I find that in moments where identification with memory softens, there is a noticeable intentional increase in openness, the present moment feels less constrained by expectation and more available for direct engagement. This openness is not passive. It is deeply alert and responsive, yet it is not driven by the urgency of past conditioning. Instead, it operates from a place of immediate perception where each situation is encountered as new rather than as repetition of something already known. This freshness of perception appears to be one of the key factors in creative insight because creativity seems to arise most naturally when the mind is not confined by rigid interpretive patterns. Another observation that continues to emerge is the relationship between silence and understanding. Silence here is not merely the absence of sound, but a quality of awareness in which mental activity becomes less dominant and subtler forms of perception become more accessible in this silence. Understanding does not feel constructed through effort, but rather revealed through presence. It is as if information that was always available becomes suddenly intelligible when the internal environment is sufficiently quiet to receive it. This suggests that insight may not always require more thinking, but sometimes requires less interference from habitual thinking patterns. As this becomes clearer, I notice a gradual shift in how questions themselves are experienced. Instead of being problems that demand immediate resolution, questions begin to function as open spaces of exploration. They no longer create tension, but rather invite attention into deeper layers of inquiry, where direct experience becomes the primary source of understanding rather than conceptual analysis alone. This shift transforms the relationship with uncertainty because uncertainty is no longer viewed as something to eliminate, but as a necessary condition for continued discovery. I also begin to recognize that the sense of separation between internal experience and external world is not as solid as it initially appears. Perception creates a continuous interface between the two where meaning is generated through interaction rather than isolation. What is perceived externally is always influenced by internal state, and internal state is continuously shaped by external input. This reciprocal relationship suggests that experience is fundamentally relational rather than purely objective or purely subjective. And in this relational field, identity itself begins to appear less like a fixed entity and more like an ongoing process of interaction between awareness and environment. As this understanding deepens, I find myself becoming more attentive to the subtle ways in which interpretation shapes experience. In real time, a slight shift in attention can change the emotional tone of a moment. A small adjustment in perception can alter the sense of possibility within a situation. These changes are often so subtle that they go unnoticed, yet over time they accumulate into significant transformations in how life is lived and experienced. This reveals that the architecture of experience is highly responsive to internal states, and that even minor shifts in awareness can produce meaningful changes in trajectory. What becomes increasingly present in this exploration is a sense that nothing in experience is truly static. Everything is in motion: perception, thought, emotion, sensation, and even identity itself appear to be continuously unfolding processes rather than fixed structures. And within this movement, there is a deeper stillness that does not oppose change, but contains it. This stillness is not separate from activity, but is present within it as an underlying continuity that allows experience to be known at all. And as I remain with this recognition, there is a growing sense that the exploration itself is not moving toward a final conclusion, but opening into further dimensions of inquiry, where each layer of understanding reveals additional layers beneath it. And in this ongoing unfolding, I continue to observe what emerges next without attempting to finalize interpretation, because what is becoming increasingly evident is that awareness does not arrive at completion. It expands through continuous observation, and in that expansion there is always more to perceive, more to integrate, and more to understand as the process of unfolding continues beyond the edges of what can currently be articulated or fully comprehended in conceptual form. And as this continuous unfolding deepens, I begin to notice that even the idea of more is itself a construct emerging within awareness rather than something existing outside of it, waiting to be discovered in a linear sequence. This realization subtly shifts the entire orientation of inquiry, because it suggests that expansion is not movement toward an external destination, but a refinement of perception within the present field of experience. What I once interpreted as progression now feels more like increasing resolution of the same underlying reality, as if attention is gradually tuning itself to finer levels of coherence that were always present but not previously perceived with clarity. In this state, I find that the boundaries between observer and observed become increasingly difficult to maintain as separate categories, not because they collapse into confusion, but because they reveal themselves as interdependent aspects of a single process of knowing experience. Does not appear as something happening to me, but as something happening within a shared field of awareness that includes the sense of me as one of its expressions. This shift is subtle yet profoundly reorganizing because it removes the need to position oneself as separate from life in order to understand it. Instead, understanding begins to arise from participation rather than distance. I often notice that when this participatory mode of awareness becomes stable even briefly, there is a natural reduction in inner tension. The mind no longer feels compelled to maintain rigid explanations about what is happening because experience itself becomes self-illuminating in real time. This does not mean that thinking disappears, but rather that thinking becomes transparent. It is seen as a process occurring within awareness rather than the totality of awareness itself. And in this recognition, thoughts lose their absolute authority and become more flexible, adaptive, and responsive to present context. There is also a profound change in the way time is experienced in these moments. Time no longer feels like a strict sequence of past, present, and future, but more like a layered field where different degrees of immediacy coexist simultaneously. The present moment feels expanded, containing echoes of memory and anticipations of possibility without being dominated by either this expanded present creates a sense of continuity that is not dependent on mental narration but on direct sensory and perceptual engagement with what is unfolding now. I begin to understand that much of human stress arises from the fragmentation of attention across these temporal dimensions. When attention is pulled excessively into the past through regret or into the future through anticipation, the present becomes compressed and experience feels constrained. Yet, when attention returns to immediacy, there is a natural restoration of coherence that allows the nervous system to settle into a more balanced state. This balance is not achieved through force, but through recognition of where attention is being placed and the gentle reorientation toward present awareness. As this continues to develop, I notice that the relationship with internal dialogue begins to shift significantly. The constant stream of commentary that once felt like an essential part of identity becomes more optional. It is still present, but no longer dominates perception in the same way. Instead, it is observed as one layer among many within the broader field of experience. This creates a sense of spaciousness, where silence and thought coexist without conflict, and within that coexistence there is a deeper clarity that does not rely on verbal explanation. In this clarity, emotional experiences also begin to reveal new qualities. Rather than being experienced as purely reactive states, emotions appear as dynamic movements of energy and information within the system, each carrying its own intelligence and direction. When they are allowed to be fully present without resistance, they tend to complete their natural cycle more efficiently, rather than becoming fixed patterns that linger beyond their functional purpose. This observation suggests that emotional health may be closely related to the degree of openness with which emotional states are allowed to be experienced. I also begin to see that the sense of personal identity is deeply intertwined with narrative continuity. The mind constructs a story that links past experiences to present interpretations and projected futures, creating a coherent sense of self over time. Yet when attention is placed more directly on immediate experience, this narrative structure becomes less central. Identity is still functional, but it is no longer the primary reference point for understanding what is happening. Instead, identity becomes one expression within a broader field of awareness that is not confined by narrative structure alone. This shift does not erase individuality, but recontextualizes it. Individuality becomes a dynamic expression of awareness rather than a fixed definition of it. This allows for greater flexibility in how experience is engaged, because the pressure to maintain a consistent self-image diminishes, and in its place there is a more fluid responsiveness to what each moment requires. As I continue observing these patterns, I become increasingly aware that transformation is not something that happens at a single moment, but something that unfolds continuously through repeated moments of recognition. Each time, awareness notices a habitual pattern without immediately identifying with it. A small reorganization occurs within the system. Over time, these micro-shifts accumulate, leading to significant changes in perception, behavior, and emotional stability. without requiring dramatic intervention. There is also a growing sense that awareness itself may not be confined to the individual system that appears to host it while experience is localized through the body and mind. There is a quality of awareness that feels inherently non-local, not in a speculative sense, but in the direct experience of openness that does not feel bounded by personal narrative. This does not negate individuality, but suggests that individuality may be one expression of a broader field of consciousness rather than its totality. And as this recognition gently settles into the background of experience, I find myself unable to conclude the inquiry because each layer of understanding reveals another layer beneath it, and each insight opens into further questions that do not demand resolution, but invite continued exploration. What remains most present is the sense that awareness is still unfolding, still reorganizing, and still revealing dimensions of experience that were not previously accessible. And in that unfolding, there is a quiet invitation to remain attentive to what emerges next, without closing the inquiry, without finalizing interpretation, and without assuming that what is currently known represents the boundary of what can be known as the process of observation, continues beyond conceptual limits into a field of experience that remains open, dynamic, and continuously becoming. And as this continuous becoming remains present in awareness, I begin to notice that the very act of trying to capture it in language introduces a subtle compression of something that is inherently expansive, as if experience is multidimensional while language is linear. And every attempt to translate between the two creates a gentle distortion that can be useful for communication, but never fully complete. In representation, this realization does not diminish the value of language, but places it in its proper context as a symbolic bridge, rather than the territory itself. And when I hold that distinction more clearly, there is a noticeable relaxation in the need to define experience with precision in order for it to be meaningful. Instead, meaning begins to feel less like something assigned through explanation and more like something directly perceived through engagement with life as it unfolds in real time. I find that when attention is fully present, even simple experiences carry layers of depth that are often missed. When the mind is preoccupied with interpretation, the sensation of breathing, the feeling of movement, the subtle shifts in emotional tone all become part of a coherent field of awareness that is continuously communicating information about internal and external states. What becomes increasingly evident is that the nervous system is not merely reacting to life, but continuously constructing a model of reality based on incoming sensory data, internal memory patterns, and predictive processing. This model is not fixed, but constantly updated and revised, which means that perception itself is an ongoing negotiation between what is present and what is expected. When expectation dominates perception, becomes rigid. When direct observation dominates perception, becomes flexible and more aligned with immediate reality. I have also begun to observe how deeply prediction shapes experience before anything fully enters conscious awareness. The mind is already anticipating outcomes based on previous patterns, and these anticipations subtly influence emotional tone, physiological readiness, and behavioral inclination. In many cases, what we call intuition may be the conscious awareness of these predictive processes surfacing into attention before they are fully articulated as thought. When this is understood, prediction is no longer seen as limitation, but as a functional aspect of how consciousness organizes experience in time at that. There is something particularly interesting that emerges when prediction is held lightly rather than rigidly, when expectations are treated as hypotheses rather than certainties. Perception becomes more open to correction, and the system as a whole becomes more adaptive. This adaptability appears to be a core feature of biological intelligence, allowing human beings to respond effectively to environments that are constantly changing rather than fixed. As I continue to explore this interplay between prediction, perception, and awareness, I notice that the sense of control over experience begins to shift. Control, in the traditional sense, feels less central and is replaced by participation, where the focus is not on determining every outcome, but on maintaining clarity within the process of engagement. This shift reduces internal tension because it removes the burden of needing to manage every variable and instead emphasize responsiveness to what is actually occurring. In this mode of awareness, challenges are still present, but they are experienced differently. They are no longer seen as disruptions to a desired state, but as part of the ongoing feedback system through which learning and adaptation occur. This does not eliminate difficulty, but changes its function. Within experience, difficulty becomes informational rather than purely obstructive, and this reframing has a direct impact on emotional regulation and cognitive flexibility. I also find that as this perspective deepens the distinction between internal and external experience becomes increasingly porous, what was once considered external reality begins to feel inseparable from the interpretive processes occurring within consciousness, because every experience is mediated through perception, and every perception is shaped by internal state. This does not imply that external reality is unreal, but rather that it is always encountered through a living interface of consciousness and biology working together. This recognition naturally leads to a more careful attention to internal state, because it becomes clear that how one is internally organized influences how the world is experienced, and in turn how one responds to it. This creates a feedback loop where internal states shape external experience, and external experience reshapes internal states continuously over time. Understanding this loop introduces a new level of responsibility, not as obligation, but as awareness of participation in the construction of lived reality. As this understanding matures, I begin to see that many of the boundaries that once seemed fundamental, such as self and environment, subject and object, inner and outer, are actually conceptual distinctions used to navigate complexity rather than absolute divisions within experience itself. When these distinctions are held lightly, they remain useful. But when they are taken as fixed, they can obscure the underlying continuity that connects all aspects of experience. Within this continuity, there is a sense of ongoing integration occurring beneath conscious effort, where thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions are continuously being woven into a coherent experiential field. This integration is not something that needs to be forced, but appears to be an inherent property of awareness itself. When interference decreases, integration naturally increases, and coherence becomes more stable without requiring deliberate control. I notice that this increasing coherence also affects how memory is accessed. Rather than being a rigid archive of past events, memory becomes more fluid and context-sensitive, allowing relevant aspects of past experience to arise when needed without dominating present perception. This fluidity supports learning because it allows past experience to inform present action without constraining it into repetition of old patterns. There is also a subtle but important change in how future possibilities are experienced. Instead of being fixed projections, the future feels more like an open field of potential, shaped continuously by present awareness and action. This creates a sense of agency that is grounded in immediacy rather than abstraction, because influence is understood as something that occurs through present engagement rather than distant planning alone. And as I remain attentive to this unfolding process, I become increasingly aware that even this description is only a partial reflection of something far more intricate occurring beneath language itself, where awareness continues to organize experience in ways that are simultaneously simple and profoundly complex. And in this recognition, I find myself not arriving at a conclusion, but entering more deeply into the process of observation itself, where each moment reveals further layers of subtlety, further dimensions of perception, and further questions that naturally arise without needing to be resolved, because the act of observing has itself become the primary field of exploration. And within that field, awareness continues quietly expanding without boundary, without endpoint, and without any final form into which it must ultimately settle. And as this field of observation continues without boundary, I begin to notice that even the idea of continuing is something the mind introduces in order to structure what is actually a seamless unfolding of experience. There is no clear beginning point where awareness starts and no final point where it ends, only a continuous presence through which changes are perceived and interpreted. And this recognition gradually shifts the way I relate to every moment, because instead of trying to move towards something, I begin to recognize that I am already within the movement itself. What becomes increasingly clear is that presence is not something that must be achieved, but something that is revealed when unnecessary effort dissolves. I notice how often effort is tied not to action itself, but to the mental commentary around action, the constant evaluation, comparison, and anticipation that surrounds experience rather than the experience itself. When that layer of commentary softens even slightly, there is a noticeable change in how reality is perceived. Colors feel more vivid, sounds more distinct, sensations more immediate, as if perception is being filtered less heavily through interpretation and more directly through awareness. In this state, I begin to observe that the body itself appears to function as a deeply intelligent sensing system, continuously interpreting environmental and internal signals far beyond what conscious thought can track. The nervous system adjusts posture, respiration, hormonal activity, and attention simultaneously in response to subtle shifts in perceived safety, relevance, and meaning. This creates the impression that the body is not separate from awareness, but an extension of it, expressing intelligence through biological form. I find it particularly interesting that when attention is placed gently on bodily sensation without attempting to change it, something remarkable happens. The sensation often begins to reorganize on its own tension, may soften breathing, may deepen, or emotional intensity may shift. Without deliberate intervention, this suggests that awareness itself has a regulatory influence on biological processes, not through force, but through presence and recognition. As I continue observing this relationship between awareness and biology, I notice that many of the patterns that once seemed fixed begin to reveal their adaptive nature. What was previously interpreted as personality begins to appear more like a collection of conditioned responses shaped by repeated experience and maintained through habitual attention. This does not diminish individuality, but reframes it as something dynamic and continuously evolving, rather than static or predetermined. There is a subtle but profound shift that occurs when identity is no longer anchored exclusively in these patterns. Instead, identity begins to feel more spacious, less confined by specific traits or narratives, and more aligned with the simple fact of being aware within experience. This shift reduces the pressure to maintain consistency in self-image, because awareness itself does not require consistency in form. It remains present through all changes in thought, emotion, and perception. I also begin to notice how much of human suffering is tied to resistance against the natural variability of experience when pleasant states are clung to and unpleasant states are rejected. A tension is created that amplifies both attachment and aversion. However, when experience is allowed to move freely through awareness without immediate resistance, the intensity of that tension often decreases. Not because conditions change, but because the relationship to conditions changes. This change in relationship is subtle yet foundational. It alters how events are interpreted and integrated into the ongoing flow of life. Instead of being seen as fixed judgments about reality, experiences become temporary configurations within awareness, each carrying information that can be acknowledged without needing to define the entire sense of self around them. This allows for a more fluid interaction with life, where learning becomes continuous rather than episodic. As this understanding deepens, I begin to recognize that attention itself is not only selective but creative in nature. What is repeatedly attended to becomes strengthened within perception, while what is neglected gradually fades from prominence. This means that attention is constantly participating in the shaping of internal and external experience in ways that are often unnoticed, because they occur gradually over time rather than through sudden change. This realization brings a greater sense of responsibility to how attention is directed, not as a rigid discipline, but as a gentle awareness of where energy is being invested internally. When attention is repeatedly drawn toward limitation, the experience of limitation becomes reinforced. When attention is repeatedly drawn toward possibility, openness, and curiosity, those qualities become more prominent within lived experience. I also observe that the mind has a tendency to seek resolution, to experience even when experience itself does not require resolution. There is a habitual drive to complete unfinished narratives, to categorize ambiguous states, and to arrive at certainty, yet in many cases it is precisely the absence of immediate resolution that allows deeper insight to emerge. When uncertainty is held without rushing toward closure, perception becomes more receptive to information that would otherwise be filtered out. In this receptive state, I begin to notice subtle layers of experience that are normally overshadowed by mental activity. The space between thoughts becomes more noticeable, the micro shifts in emotion become more discernible, and the body's internal rhythms become part of conscious awareness rather than background processes. This expanded sensitivity does not overwhelm the system, but instead creates a more integrated sense of being where multiple levels of experience are simultaneously accessible. There is also a growing recognition that the distinction between internal observation and external reality is not as clear as it initially appears, because perception always involves interpretation. The world is never encountered directly without mediation. It is always filtered through sensory processing, memory, expectation, and emotional state. This does not make experience less real, but highlights that reality as experienced is always a co-creation between incoming information and the structures through which that information is interpreted. When this is seen clearly, there is a natural softening of rigid conclusions about how things are supposed to be, because it becomes evident that perception is inherently dynamic and subject to change as internal conditions shift. This openness allows for greater adaptability because it reduces the need to defend fixed interpretations of reality and instead encourages ongoing inquiry into how experience is unfolding in the present moment. As I continue to rest in this mode of inquiry, I notice that even the sense of being an individual observer begins to feel less solid and more fluid. There is still a functional sense of perspective, but it no longer feels like a fixed center from which everything is being interpreted. Instead, it feels more like a shifting point within a larger field of awareness that is continuously reorganizing itself through experience. And in this recognition, there is no final conclusion, forming only a deepening sense that what is being explored cannot be separated from the process of exploring itself, because awareness is both the medium and the activity through which understanding arises. And as this continues to unfold, there remains a quiet openness to whatever may emerge next, without expectation, without closure, and without the assumption that any particular level of understanding represents the end point of what is possible. Because even now, as these words form, there is still a deeper movement occurring beneath them that continues beyond description, beyond structure, and beyond the limits of conceptual thought, into a field of experience that remains continuously alive, continuously responsive, and continuously becoming.
When we explore human consciousness through both scientific understanding and lived experience, we begin to see something deeply important. You are not a fixed identity moving through a static world. You are a continuously updating system of perception, meaning, emotion, and biological response. And once you truly understand this, even in a simple way, the way you relate to life begins to shift. Let me guide you through this slowly and clearly, because these ideas are powerful, but they are also easy to misunderstand if we rush. At the foundation of everything we discussed is a simple principle from neuroscience. The brain is a prediction system. It is constantly trying to guess what will happen next based on past experience. This means you are not just reacting to reality, you are interpreting it through a filter built from memory. For example, if someone has experienced criticism in the past, their brain may begin to anticipate criticism even in neutral situations. A simple facial expression from another person might be interpreted as judgment even if none exists. This is not imagination, it is predictive processing. The brain is trying to protect you by preparing in advance. But here is where awareness becomes powerful. When you become conscious of this process, you create space between what is happening and what your mind is predicting. In that space, you gain choice. Now let's move deeper. Your emotional state is not separate from your biology. It is a biological event. When you feel fear, your body activates stress chemistry. When you feel calm or connected, your body shifts into repair and balance. This is managed through your autonomic nervous system, which operates automatically without conscious control. A simple way to understand this is to think of your body as having two primary modes. One is the survival mode, where the body focuses on protection. The other is the growth and restoration mode, where the body focuses on healing, learning, and creativity. Most people move between these states without awareness. often spending long periods in subtle stress. The important insight is not to eliminate stress completely, that is not realistic, but to learn how to recognize when you are in it and gently shift your internal state. One of the most effective ways to do this is through attention. Attention is not just mental focus, it is biological direction. Wherever your attention goes, your nervous system follows. If your attention is constantly on problems, uncertainty, or imagined future outcomes, your body begins to behave as if those experiences are happening now. This is why chronic worry can feel physically exhausting, even when nothing external is actually occurring. Now, let's simplify something that often feels abstract: consciousness. You can think of consciousness as the space in which all experience happens. Thoughts appear in it, emotions move through it, sensations arise within it. But consciousness itself is not the content, it is the awareness of the content. A helpful analogy is the sky and the weather. Thoughts and emotions are like weather patterns. Consciousness is like the sky. Storms may come and go, but the sky remains open. When people begin to recognize this directly, not just intellectually, they experience a shift. Instead of saying, "I am anxious," they begin to notice anxiety is present. This small change creates psychological distance, and that distance is powerful. It allows the nervous system to settle because you are no longer fully identified with the emotional state. Now, let's connect this to real life. Imagine you receive a message that triggers frustration. Normally, the reaction is immediate: interpretation, emotional escalation, and response. But if you are aware, there is a brief moment where you notice the sensation in your body, the thought forming in your mind, and the emotion arising. In that moment, you are no longer fully inside the reaction, you are observing it. That observation is the beginning of transformation. Because what you observe, you can no longer unconsciously become. Now let's talk about something even more subtle: emotional repetition. The brain learns through repetition. If you repeatedly experience stress, your system becomes more familiar with stress than with calm. This does not mean you are broken. It means your biology adapts to your most common emotional environment. This is why change often feels uncomfortable at first. New emotional states feel unfamiliar, but with practice, they become the new baseline. So how do we begin shifting this pattern in practical life? First, start with awareness of the body. Several times a day, pause and notice your breathing. Is it shallow or deep? Is your body tense or relaxed? This simple check-in interrupts unconscious stress cycles. Second, observe your thoughts without immediately believing them. Not every thought is a truth. Many thoughts are predictions based on old experiences. When you notice this, you weaken their automatic control over your emotions. Third, intentionally create small moments of emotional balance. This can be as simple as recalling something you are grateful for or focusing on a moment of genuine appreciation. These states are not just positive thinking, they are biological signals that shift your nervous system. Over time, these small practices accumulate. Now let's address identity. Most people believe identity is fixed. This is who I am. But in reality, identity is a pattern of repetition. It is made of thoughts you repeat, emotions you return to, and behaviors you practice. If you change the pattern, identity changes with it. This is important because it means growth is not about becoming someone else. It is about reducing unconscious repetition, so new possibilities can emerge naturally. Another key insight is that your inner state influences how you interpret the world. Two people can experience the same situation and have completely different interpretations. One sees threat, another sees opportunity. The difference is not the situation, it is the internal state of perception. This is why inner work matters. It changes the lens through which life is experienced. Now let's bring everything together. You are a biological system designed for adaptation. Your thoughts influence your emotions. Your emotions influence your body. Your body influences your behavior. And your behavior shapes your life experience. But the most important point is this: awareness sits at the center of all of it. Awareness allows you to notice patterns instead of being trapped inside them. Awareness gives you space to choose instead of react. Awareness creates the possibility of transformation without force. So if there is one practical takeaway from everything we explored, it is this: do not try to control your entire life at once. Instead, learn to observe your inner world with consistency. Because what you observe clearly, you begin to understand. And what you understand, you naturally begin to transform. And as this understanding deepens over time, something subtle begins to change in how you experience each moment, as if life itself becomes less like something happening to you and more like something you are finally awake enough to participate in fully, with clarity, presence, and a quiet sense of evolving awareness that continues unfolding in ways that are still just beginning to be discovered